Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm, somewhere ancient and unhurried, where the air carries the smell of river water and fresh bread, and the day begins long before the sun has fully decided to rise. We are not going to the monuments tonight. We are not standing at the foot of anything enormous. We are going somewhere much smaller and much closer to the texture of a single ordinary day, lived along the banks of the Nile, by people who woke and worked and ate and rested and gathered under the stars, the same way people have always done. There is something in that ordinariness that feels worth sitting with. The grand things have been written about endlessly, but the smell of bread in a clay oven before dawn, that is something else. That is something that brings a world back to life in a way that no monument quite manages. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. The day in ancient Egypt began in the dim hours before sunrise, not because anyone was required to rise early in some formal sense, but because the early morning was simply the finest part of the day, the only part that was genuinely cool, genuinely soft, genuinely manageable. By midday, the heat would settle over everything like a weight, and heavy work would become nearly impossible. So the morning was where the day lived. That was where things were done. A farmer would already be moving through his fields before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the soil still holding something of the night's coolness beneath his feet. A baker would have her oven going well before that, the smell of bread moving through narrow mud-brick streets before most of her neighbors had opened their eyes. And from the riverbank below, the sound of water being drawn would already be drifting upward, steady and familiar, the way it had been every morning for as long as anyone could remember. The houses themselves were small and low, built from the same mud brick that the Nile's floodplain offered so generously. In the early hours they were cool and pleasant, the thick walls still holding the night's temperature, the way a stone floor stays cool long after the air above it has begun to warm. By afternoon, that same quality would reverse entirely, and the walls would return the day's gathered heat back into every room. But in the morning, there was a brief and gentle window where the house felt like shelter in the most complete sense, dim and quiet and still. Breakfast, when it came, was simple. Bread and beer were at the center of nearly every morning meal in ancient Egypt, for nearly every person regardless of where they stood in the world. Not wine, beer, though calling it beer perhaps gives the wrong impression. It was something thicker and more nourishing than that word suggests, closer in texture to a fermented porridge than anything poured from a vessel today. It was not especially strong. It was simply food in liquid form, something that provided energy and was safer to drink than river water drawn without care. Children drank it alongside their parents. Workers carried it to the fields. It was woven into the fabric of daily life so completely that it was used alongside bread as a form of payment. The men who worked on state-building projects were not paid in coins. They were paid in rations, a measured weight of bread, a measured volume of beer, and this was considered fair and sufficient because it was exactly what a person needed to move through a day. Onions and garlic were common alongside the bread. Dried fish, when it was available, sometimes a few figs or a handful of lentils softened in water overnight. The morning meal was not elaborate, and it was not meant to be. It was warm and familiar, and enough eaten in the early quiet before the work of the day had fully gathered itself. The Nile was never far from any of this. It was not simply the river that ran beside the town. It was the reason the town existed at all, the reason the fields were generous, and the bread was possible, and the fish were there to be dried in the sun. Every year, with a patience that the Egyptians had built their entire world around, the river flooded its banks and left behind a layer of dim, rich sediment that made the surrounding land some of the most giving on earth. The flood was not feared exactly. It was watched for, prepared for, understood as the rhythm that everything else followed. A good flood meant abundance. A flood that fell short meant something harder. And so the river was not simply geography. It was the shape of the year itself. Water was drawn from it each morning, for drinking, for cooking, for washing. People bathed in it. Children moved along its edges in the early light. Boats crossed it steadily, carrying grain and linen and oil between settlements, moving workers and traders and families from one bank to the other. The sound of the river was simply the sound of life, always present, flowing slowly beneath everything else, the way a deep note runs beneath a melody, without ever calling attention to itself. The morning was still young, the sun was still low and pale above the eastern edge of the desert, and the day, long and warm and full of its own particular texture, was only just beginning to unfold. The sun was climbing now. That pale early light had shifted into something fuller, something warmer, pressing gently down on the mud-brick walls and the narrow paths that wound between them. The air, which had been cool and almost soft an hour before, was beginning to carry the first suggestion of what the afternoon would become. Not yet uncomfortable, but already different, already asking something of the people moving through it. And so the morning moved with a kind of quiet intention. There was an understanding woven into the rhythm of Egyptian life so deeply that it needed no explanation, that the hours before midday were the hours that mattered most, the ones that could be used, every task that required effort, carrying, building, planting, hauling water, tending animals, moving goods from one place to another, belonged to the morning, and everyone seemed to know this without being told. The marketplace was already alive. It had come together the way it always did, gradually and without ceremony, as people arrived from different directions carrying what they had and looking for what they needed. There were no prices marked anywhere, and no coins changing hands. Instead, there was conversation, patient, practiced, the kind that had been happening in this same general form for generations, a length of linen for a measure of grain, a jar of oil for a quantity of dried fish. The value of things was understood through use and familiarity, and the exchange itself was a kind of language, spoken quietly between people who had been doing this long enough to know how it went. Grain was among the most common things moving through a place like this. Linen was another, woven in households across the region, traded in lengths, used for clothing and wrapping, and any number of ordinary purposes. Oil pressed from various plants moved in sealed jars, carried with some care. Beer moved in vessels that were handled with a little attention, because spilling it was a small loss that no one was particularly interested in accepting. The sounds of all of this were layered and dense. Voices, the movement of animals, the soft scrape of pottery against stone, the occasional raised tone of someone who felt the terms being offered were not quite fair. Personal cleanliness was something Egyptians attended to with genuine seriousness, and the morning hours were when this too found its place in the day. Bathing happened along the river's edge, not a hurried thing but a regular and expected part of the morning. Skin was oiled afterward, scented oils pressed gently into the surface to protect against the dry air and the long hours of sun that were simply unavoidable. The oils were not purely ornamental, they were practical, a layer of something between the skin and the heat, and they were used by nearly everyone, regardless of their station. Kohl was applied around the eyes, that fine and familiar line that has become one of the most recognizable images from this world. Men wore it, women wore it, and children were given it as well. It was deliberate and considered, but it was not purely decorative. The belief was that it offered some protection against the glare of the sun, softening the light that entered the eye the way shadow softens heat. There was also a sense that it offered protection of a different kind, something less visible, more woven into the understanding of how the world worked, and what kept a person safe within it. Whatever the reason, it was simply part of what a face looked like in the morning, as ordinary as the bread that had been eaten an hour before. The work that filled the middle of the morning was varied and particular to each household, each trade, each arrangement. A scribe might be settling into his work, seated, reed pen in hand, the surface before him waiting. A craftsman might be shaping something from wood or stone or clay, moving carefully through the cooler hours to finish what the afternoon would make impossible to continue. A farmer would already have been in the fields for some time, working the soil, or tending the long, narrow irrigation channels that carried water from the river into the planted land, those slow, deliberate passages that made the fields possible at all. Women managed much of what happened within the household, the grinding of grain, the baking, the weaving, the care of children, the quiet organization of what the family had and what it needed. This was not separate from the life of the community. It was the foundation of it. The bread that moved through the marketplace began here, in houses where the work of the morning was already well underway before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Children moved through all of this the way that children do, present in the middle of things, involved in small tasks, learning by proximity, what their world expected of them. They helped carry, they watched, they played in the spaces between the work, along the river's edge, in the shade of walls that were still cool from the night. The line between childhood and the beginning of adult responsibility was not sharply drawn, it shifted gradually, the way the light shifted through the morning hours, almost without a clear moment when one thing became another. The sun was higher now. The shadows that had stretched long and cool across the paths in the early hours had pulled themselves inward, growing shorter and narrower as the light came more directly from above. The air had changed again. What had been a suggestion of heat an hour ago was something more than a suggestion now, settling in, pressing gently down on the walls and the ground, and the people moving through the open spaces between buildings. The morning's work was beginning to wind toward its close, not because everything had been finished, but because the day itself was asking for a pause, the long, familiar pause that everyone knew was coming, and that no one, in this particular world, thought to resist. The marketplace was already in motion by the time the midday pause arrived, or rather it was the last place in the city where motion continued at all, carried forward by the particular energy of people who had traveled some distance to be there and were not yet ready to stop. It was a loud place, not the kind of loud that comes from chaos, but the kind that comes from many people speaking at once, each conversation layering softly over the next, until the whole space held a kind of low, continuous murmur. Voices rose and fell, the sound of goods being moved passed through the air, like something woven into it, and occasionally a voice would lift above the rest, someone who had spotted a familiar face across the crowd. There was no money here, not in the way we would understand it. What moved between hands was grain, linen, oil, dried fish, small measures of beer. A length of woven cloth might become a jar of oil, which might later become a portion of grain, which might become something else entirely by the end of the afternoon. The trading moved in long, unhurried chains, each exchange a small negotiation, a moment of weighing and considering, before something passed from one person to another, and the chain continued on. Grain was perhaps the most common measure of all. It moved through the marketplace the way a language moves through a conversation, as the common ground on which everything else was understood. A worker who had been paid in bread rations might bring a portion of what he had received to exchange for something his household needed. The bread that had been baked before dawn, in a small house along a narrow path, had by now entered the wider world, finding its way into new hands through the slow, unhurried logic of barter. Linen was another kind of wealth. Egyptian linen was finely made. The fibers of the flax plant spun into cloth that ranged from coarse and practical to something so fine it was nearly transparent in the light. A good length of linen carried real value. It could be stored, carried, traded for almost anything. Households that produced more than they needed could bring the surplus here, into the noise and press of the market, and leave with something different. The smell of the place was its own kind of texture. Dried fish had a presence that reached well beyond the stall where it was sold. Onions and garlic, carried in bundles or piled in open containers, gave the air a sharpness that mixed with the smell of bodies and dust and the faint sweetness of grain warming in the sun. It was not a delicate smell. It was the smell of a place where real things were being exchanged by real people who had walked some distance to be there. Coal was visible on nearly every face moving through the crowd, the fine, dim line drawn along the edges of the eyes that was as ordinary here as clothing. Men wore it. Women wore it. Children wore it. It had been applied that morning as part of the same quiet routine that included washing and oiling the skin against the dryness of the air. The eyes of the marketplace were lined and steady, moving over goods and faces with the practiced attention of people who had been doing this all their lives. By now the heat had become the dominant fact of the afternoon. The marketplace thinned as the sun reached its highest point, not all at once, but gradually, the way a crowd disperses when the reason for gathering has slowly passed. Stalls grew quieter. The conversations that had been layering over one another began to separate, to thin, until there were only a few voices left moving through the spaces where many had been before. The city was entering its long pause. Inside the mudbrick houses, the walls held something of the coolness of the night. Not much, and not for much longer, but enough to make the interior bearable, while the outside world burned. People rested on woven mats, on low wooden frames strung with cord or leather, in whatever shade the interior offered. Sleep came easily in the middle of the day here, not as a luxury, but as a simple response to what the body needed. The rhythm of the day had always included this, not rest stolen from productivity, but part of the structure of the hours, built in as naturally as the morning's early rising. The hours themselves were not fixed in the way we might expect. The Egyptians divided the day into 12 equal portions of light and 12 of darkness. This meant that a summer hour was long and generous, and a winter hour was something shorter and more narrow. Time was not a constant here. It stretched and narrowed with the seasons, shaped by the sun in the same way that everything else in this world was shaped by it. Outside, the river moved on without pausing. It always did. The Nile had its own rhythm, older and slower than anything happening along its banks. The long annual cycle of rising and falling that the people of this place had organized their entire lives around. The flood would come again, as it always came, carrying with it the dim silt that made the fields possible. And when it receded, the planting would begin again, and the long work of coaxing abundance from the land would continue as it had for generations beyond counting. For now, in the suspended stillness of the afternoon, the river simply flowed, wide and unhurried, and indifferent to the pause that had settled over the city beside it. The light on the water was very bright, and the air above it shimmered faintly with heat, and the far bank was a soft line of green and then sand, and then the pale, enormous sky. The pause would not last forever. Somewhere in the later hours, the quality of the light would begin to soften, not all at once, but slowly, the way everything shifted in this world, and the city would stir again, and the second part of the day would begin to unfold. The light changed the way light changes when it has been very bright for a long time, and finally begins to release its hold, not all at once. Gradually, the way a long breath is slowly let go, the white intensity of midday softened toward something more golden, and the shadows that had been small and sharp began to lengthen and grow uncertain at their edges. The city beside the river felt this shift before it fully understood it, the way a sleeper becomes aware of the room before fully waking. A door opened somewhere, a voice carried across a courtyard, the long pause was loosening. People emerged from the interiors of their houses the way things emerge from still water, unhurriedly, one at a time, moving into the changed light. Children first, as children often are, finding their way back into the lanes and open spaces between the mud-brick walls. Then the adults, moving with the particular ease of bodies that have rested and are now willing to be asked something of again. The quality of the afternoon had shifted enough that work was possible once more, and so the second portion of the day began to unfold in the same natural way the first had, not announced, simply arriving. Along the river, the water carriers returned. The Nile was never empty of people, but there were rhythms to its use, and the late afternoon brought a particular kind of movement back to its banks. Women came with wide clay vessels balanced against their hips, or carried on their heads. The water they drew was the same water it had always been, the same river, the same current, but in the lowering light it looked different, softer, less blinding. The surface held the color of the sky in a way it could not manage at midday, and the far bank had deepened from pale to something warmer, and the green that edged the water seemed more itself in this light than in any other. Washing happened here too, in the shallower reaches near the bank. Linen was brought down and worked against smooth stones, then spread across the low scrub to dry in whatever warmth the afternoon still held. The Egyptians took care with their linen. It was not simply clothing, it was also a measure of wealth, something that could be offered in the marketplace for grain or oil, the small glazed amulets that people carried close to their bodies, for reasons that were partly practical and partly something older and harder to name. The marketplace itself had come back to life. The traders who had rested through the worst of the heat were returning to their places, spreading their goods again across mats and low tables, lengths of linen, jars of oil, small measures of grain, bundles of onion and leek, fish that had been salted and left to dry in the sun. There was no coin here. A transaction was a conversation, a negotiation, a slow working out of what one thing was worth against another, a length of linen for a measure of grain, a jar of oil for a measure of beer. The values were not fixed. They shifted with scarcity and season and the particular needs of the two people standing across from each other in the afternoon light. The smell of the marketplace was dense and layered. There were spices and the particular sharpness of fish that had been salted and dried in the sun. And beneath those, something sweeter, fresh bread, still warm from the clay ovens that had been lit again as the heat of the day began to ease. The bread that emerged from those ovens was coarse and substantial, made from emmer wheat that had been ground between stones. The grinding left traces of grit in the flour that wore at the teeth over a lifetime. Bakers knew this. Everyone knew this. It was simply part of what bread was, in the same way that the heat was part of what the day was. The evening meal was already being considered in most households. What had been gathered, what had been traded for, what the river had offered. These were the materials of it. Vegetables roasted over low fires, fish wrapped in leaves and set into the embers, onions and garlic, eaten with an ease and frequency that would have been familiar in any kitchen in any era, because some flavors are simply what they are and do not require improvement, and always the beer poured from wide-mouthed jars into shallow cups, nourishing and faintly sour, somewhere between bread and something slowly fermented. In households with more, there were other things. Wine, brought in sealed vessels from the vineyards in the Delta region, where the soil held enough moisture to support the vines, roasted fowl, fruits, figs, and dates, and the occasional pomegranate, which was prized enough that it appeared in paintings on the walls of tombs, held in the hands of the living, as a sign of what abundance looked like. The distance between a simple household and a wealthy one was not invisible here. It showed in the evening meal more than anywhere else. But even in the simplest house, the evening carried something that the rest of the day did not quite manage. A quality of ease. The worst of the heat was behind them. The work of the day was mostly done, and the long coolness of the night was beginning to move in from the desert. Families gathered. The mud-brick walls, which had absorbed so much warmth through the long afternoon, were beginning slowly to release it, and the air inside the houses was still warm, while the air outside was softening. And above the rooftops, the sky was beginning its own slow transformation, the blue deepening through shades that had no names precise enough for them, moving toward something vast and dim and full of what the night would bring. The rooftops filled slowly, the way evening always filled, not all at once, but in a gradual gathering, one family and then another, voices drifting up from the narrow streets below, and settling somewhere above the mud-brick walls where the air moved more freely. Children who had been still and quiet through the long afternoon were beginning to stir again. The heat had been their silence, and now that it was lifting, something in them was lifting with it. The sky above the Nile Valley held its colors longer than skies do in other places. Something in the dry air, the wide open reach of the desert on either side, it all allowed the light to linger in ways that felt almost deliberate, shades of amber and rose, and a kind of warm ochre that seemed to come from within the horizon rather than above it. And then, gradually, the first stars. There was no separation between the rooftop and the night sky. No glass, no distance, no softening layer between the eye and what the sky was doing. The stars appeared as they always had over that valley, as something almost overwhelming in its fullness. The Milky Way was not a faint smear, but a wide, luminous river of its own, arching from one edge of the visible world to the other. Egyptians had been reading that sky for so long that its patterns were woven into their calendar, their planting, their understanding of when the flood would come and when it would withdraw. The star Sirius, the brightest in the night sky, rose just before dawn each year, in a way that aligned with the beginning of the flood season. Its appearance was not merely noted, it was celebrated, and woven into the religious life of the whole civilization. But on an ordinary evening, a family on a rooftop was not thinking in those terms. They were simply there beneath it, in the same way that people have always been beneath a sky too large to fully hold in mind. Music moved through the evenings in ways that are now difficult to fully recover. The instruments existed: harps, lutes, flutes made from hollow reeds, small drums whose skins had been stretched and dried in the sun. The melodies themselves are gone, dissolved into the air of several thousand years. But the presence of music in daily life was not reserved for special occasions. It was woven into work and rest alike. Paintings in tombs showed musicians at feasts, yes, but also in fields, in workshops, in the quiet corners of ordinary households. Someone was always playing something, somewhere, in the way that sound fills a space, not because it is trying to, but because silence is only the absence of it. Storytelling was another kind of evening. The oldest written stories that survive from ancient Egypt are not simple tales. They are layered, sometimes strange, full of gods who behaved in ways that were not entirely unlike the ways of people. There were stories of transformation and of journeys through places that had no names in the waking world. And there were simpler things too. Accounts of clever animals, of people who outwitted those more powerful than themselves, of love that crossed distances and survived misfortune. These stories were not only written down, they were spoken aloud, passed from one person to another, in the same way that the recipe for bread was passed, or the knowledge of which stars meant what. The words moved through the evening air, and found their way into the people who were listening, and those people carried them forward into other evenings, in other years, long after the voices that first spoke them had grown still. Senet was played in the evenings, often on rooftops. It was a board game, 2 players, a long rectangular board divided into 30 squares, with pieces moved according to the fall of throwing sticks or knucklebones. The game was old even by Egyptian standards. Boards have been found in tombs that reach back to the earliest dynasties, which suggests it was played for thousands of years with a continuity that is almost difficult to hold in mind. The rules as they were originally played are not entirely known. What is known is that the game was taken seriously enough to be buried with the dead, and painted on walls alongside images of the gods. There was something in its movement, the way pieces advanced and were sent back and advanced again, that seemed to mirror the journey of the soul through the afterlife. But on an ordinary evening, it was simply a game. 2 people across a board, in the cooling air, with the stars overhead and the smell of the river somewhere below. The children fell asleep where they had gathered. There was no ceremony to it. They simply grew still, one and then another, in the way that children do when the warmth and the voices and the long day have finally used up everything that was keeping them awake. They were moved gently, carried down from the rooftop into the house below, where the mud-brick walls had finally released the last of the afternoon's warmth, and the air inside was close to the air, outside, soft and mild, and carrying the faint mineral scent of the river. The adults stayed longer. There was no particular reason, and no particular plan. The night was simply pleasant in a way that the day had not been, and there was a quality of ease in sitting above the narrow streets, with the sounds of the settlement growing quieter below. Dogs moved through the alleyways. Somewhere a lamp was still burning in a window. The river moved in the dimness, unhurried, carrying whatever it was carrying. Silt and seeds, and the slow memory of the mountains far to the south where the water had begun its long descent. The night was not entirely silent. It was simply a different kind of sound, the sound of a world resting rather than working, of things continuing at their own pace without anyone asking them to. The adults remained on the rooftop as the night deepened around them. The stars above the desert were not like stars seen from anywhere green or crowded. They were dense and low and seemed to press closer as the hours passed, the way a ceiling lowers in a room where the fire has gone down and everything has grown still. There was no moon yet. The darkness between the stars was a soft, deep blue rather than true black, and it held the shapes of the houses and the palms and the slow bend of the river below in a kind of gentle suspension. Someone was speaking in a low voice, not telling anything in particular, just the sound of one person continuing a thought and another listening, and the long pauses between that were not uncomfortable, but simply part of the rhythm of a late evening when there is nowhere else to be. The Nile below was a presence more than a sight. In the dimness it was barely visible, but its sound was always there, a low, continuous murmur that had been the background of every day and every night in this place for as long as anyone had been alive here. It was the sound the settlement had grown up inside of, the way a child grows up inside the sound of a particular house. So familiar that it is not noticed until something briefly interrupts it, and then it returns, and everything feels right again. There was a word the Egyptians had for the Nile that carried more weight than a simple name. They called it Iteru, the river, the great one. And yet the word itself was also simply the word for river, as though no other river needed a name, because no other river was truly a river in the way this one was. It had given the land its shape. Every field, every garden, every mud-brick wall had been made possible by the water and the silt the flood left behind each year when it withdrew. The narrow ribbon of green that ran along the river's banks, and the vast pale emptiness of the desert on either side, were not accidents of the land. They were the river's doing. The Egyptians called the fertile soil along the banks Kemet, the Black Land. It was the land that fed them. The desert beyond it they called Deshret, the Red Land, and it was not a place for living. It was a place for silence, and for the dead, and for things that had nothing more to do with the river's generous world. The flood was called the inundation, and it was not feared the way floods are feared in other places. It was waited for. When the waters rose and spread across the fields, they carried with them a mineral-rich silt from the mountains far to the south. When they withdrew, they left behind a soil so generous that it seemed almost impossible, soft and dark and willing to grow almost anything placed within it. The adults on the rooftop knew all of this the way a person knows the shape of their own house in the dim hours, not as knowledge exactly, but as something deeper and more ordinary than knowledge. The flood would come, the fields would be planted, the grain would rise and fill the granaries, and the granaries would see them through the dry months, and then the flood would come again. This was the shape of a year. It had always been the shape of a year. There was comfort in that. Not the comfort of something pleasant, but the comfort of something reliable, the kind of deep, structural ease that comes from living inside a pattern so old and so steady that doubt has no real place in it. A lamp moved somewhere in the street below. Someone was still out, carrying a small flame through the narrow passage between the houses, a figure moving at the unhurried pace of someone who knows their way and is not going far. The flame wavered once and then steadied, and then it was gone around a corner, and the street was dim again. The oil lamps used in Egyptian homes were simple things, shallow clay dishes filled with castor oil or animal fat, with a linen wick resting along one edge. They gave a soft, warm light that did not reach far, and they smelled faintly of the oil they burned. Inside the houses, they would have cast long shadows against the mud-brick walls, and the figures of people moving in that light would have appeared briefly enormous, and then small again as they passed. It was a gentle kind of illumination, enough to see by, not enough to dissolve the feeling that the night was still the night. The scent of the evening had shifted since the sun went down. The heat of the day had carried with it a sharpness, dust and dry air and the mineral edge of the baked earth. But the night air along the river was softer, and it carried the smell of the water and the reeds and the faint sweetness of whatever was growing in the gardens along the bank. Somewhere nearby, someone had been burning wood for cooking, and the last of that smell still lingered softly at the edges of everything. One of the adults rose and stretched, standing for a moment at the low parapet of the rooftop and looking out across the settlement toward the river. The water caught a little of the starlight, the palms along the bank were still, and somewhere beyond the last of the houses, the fields lay quiet in the dimness, waiting, as they always were, for the morning and the sun and the long, slow work of another day beginning. The river held the light for a long while after everything else had gone dim. That was one of the quiet things about living beside water. It kept the day a little longer than the land did, holding the last of the sky's brightness in its surface, while the fields and the houses and the narrow streets between them settled into the deeper blue of full night. From the rooftop, you could still find the river by that faint luminous quality, even when you could no longer see its banks clearly or hear it moving. The stars above the settlement were very many. There was nothing between the people on that rooftop and the full depth of the desert sky. No haze of smoke thick enough to soften it, no competing brightness from below, just the open dim, and within it, more stars than most people living in the modern world have ever seen in a single night. The Egyptians knew these stars well. They had names for the groupings, and stories woven around them, and a careful understanding of how the stars moved through the year. The rising of certain stars told a farmer when the flood was approaching. The position of others marked the slow passage of the night's hours. The sky was not simply something to look at. It was a kind of calendar, enormous and unhurried and always overhead. Children who had been restless earlier in the evening had grown still. Some were already sleeping where they had been sitting, their heads resting against a parent's side or folded into their own arms. Sleep came easily in the open air, with the warmth of the day still rising gently from the mudbrick beneath, and the soft sounds of the settlement folding around them. Adults spoke in lower voices now, or sat without speaking at all, watching the sky or the distant shimmer of the river, or simply the small circle of faces gathered near them. Sandboards had been set aside. The game was played on a long, narrow grid of 30 squares, with small carved pieces moved according to the fall of throwing sticks. It had been a favorite since the earliest dynasties, and pieces have been found in the most ordinary of households, not only in wealthy ones. On an evening like this one, it would have been played with the easy looseness of people who were not keeping careful score. The pieces moved, the sticks fell, someone laughed softly at an unlucky throw, and the game went on until the interest in it gently dissolved into something slower. Music, too, would have been part of evenings like this one, though perhaps not every night, and not always in an organized way. The Egyptians played harps, lutes, and flutes made from reed. They also used small percussion instruments, clappers of bone or ivory, hand drums with stretched animal skin. Music was present at festivals and ceremonies, but it was also simply part of life, the way it is in many places where people live closely together, and evenings are long and unhurried. A single person playing a reed flute in the cooling air, the sound carrying softly across a few rooftops, would not have been unusual. It would have been ordinary, in the best sense of that word. Storytelling moved through the evenings in a similar way, not always as a formal thing, but as something woven into conversation. Egypt had a long tradition of written literature, including tales of shipwrecked sailors and clever officials outwitting rivals. There were also stories of gods moving through the world in ways that were sometimes noble and sometimes very human in their smallness and their errors. But most people did not read. Stories passed from mouth to ear, the way they do in any place where the spoken word reaches further than the written one. A grandmother might tell a story she had heard from her own grandmother, changed slightly in the telling, as stories always are, a story about the river, or about a man who found something strange and luminous in the reeds along the bank at dawn. The oil lamps inside the house had likely been extinguished by now. There was no need for them on a clear night with the family gathered above. The rooms below would be dim and still, the sleeping mats rolled out and waiting, the clay vessels of water and oil resting in their places along the walls. The house at night was a different place than the house in the morning, quieter, more settled. The day's warmth held within its walls like something gathered and kept. Someone would need to be up before the light returned. There was water to draw, bread to begin, animals to tend if the household kept them. The rhythm of the Egyptian day had no long, slow start. It began in the last of the dim while the air was still cool enough to make movement easy, and the work was well underway before the sun had fully risen. Sleep was not a luxury so much as a practical necessity, taken seriously and ended without ceremony when the time came. But that time had not yet arrived. The night was still full, and the stars were still many, and the river was still holding its faint light along the far edge of the fields. The settlement was quiet now, in the way that settlements become quiet when most of the people within them have found their rest. Not silent, exactly, but stilled, the small sounds of breathing and water, and the occasional soft movement of an animal somewhere below all folding together into something that felt very much like peace. And somewhere in the fields beyond the last of the houses, the soil was already holding the memory of the flood, the rich dim silt left behind when the water withdrew, the same silt that had been settling there, season after season, for longer than any story could reach. The stars above the rooftop had been there all along, long before the family climbed the narrow steps to sit beneath them, and long after the last of them descended again into the house below. They did not shift with the seasons the way the river did, or the way the fields did, moving from pale and dry to green and then to the deep amber of harvest. The stars simply remained, steady and numerous, the same slow configurations that had been named and watched and used for navigation along the Nile for generations beyond any counting. The Egyptians were careful observers of the sky, not in the way of casual looking, but in the way of people for whom the sky was a working document, something read and consulted and trusted over long stretches of time. Certain stars told farmers when the flood was coming, others marked the turning of the year. The star they called Sopdet, known now as Sirius, rose just before dawn at a particular moment each summer, and when it did, the Nile was not far behind in rising. The appearance of that single star was not a symbol. It was a calendar. It was a kind of promise, made by the sky to the people watching it, and kept year after year for as long as anyone could remember. So the family resting on the rooftop was not simply gazing idly at something beautiful, though it was beautiful. They were resting inside a sky that meant something, that had always meant something, and the meaning had been passed down through enough generations that it no longer needed to be explained. It was simply known, the way the smell of the river in flood is known, or the weight of the air before a storm. Some knowledge lives in the body rather than in words. Children would have grown drowsy by now. The youngest ones may have already been carried below, or simply fallen asleep on the rooftop itself, curled on a mat with the night air moving gently over them. Sleep came easily in the open air, after a long and warm day. The body had been working since before the light, and by this hour it was ready to be still. When the tiredness came, it settled fully, and sleep followed without much ceremony. The adults stayed a little longer. There were things that only the evening allowed. A quietness of mind that the day, with all its motion and noise and heat, did not easily offer. The marketplace was closed and distant now. The animals were settled. For a little while there was simply the night, and the people within it, and the low murmur of whatever remained to be said. Families in ancient Egypt were close in the way that people become close when they share small spaces and large rhythms. The household was the center of everything, not just shelter, but the place where offerings were made to small household gods, where the sick were tended, where the very young and the very old were kept near. There were shrines in many homes, modest ones, where figures of protective deities were placed. Bes, the guardian of households and children, with his wide face and gentle ferocity. Tauret, the great hippopotamus goddess who watched over women in labor and the safety of the home. These were not distant formal presences, they were domestic ones, as familiar as the clay pots along the wall. The gods of Egypt were not only the great ones carved into temple walls, they were also the small and quiet ones who lived inside the house, who were spoken to in ordinary moments, who were asked for ordinary things: a safe birth, a healthy child, a good harvest. Protection from the scorpion that might be hiding in the sandal left beside the door. Religion in ancient Egypt was not separate from daily life. It was woven through the texture of it, the way the river was woven through the land. Not an interruption, but the very thing that made the rest possible. And now the night had deepened to the point where even the adults were growing still. The conversation had softened into silence, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silence becomes comfortable among people who have spent the whole of a day together. The rooftop would grow cool before morning, not cold, but noticeably cooler than the afternoon had been, the desert releasing its warmth into the open sky with nothing to hold it back. Sleeping above was not only pleasant, on the warmest nights, it was simply the only way to rest. Somewhere along the river, a boat was still moving. There were always boats on the Nile. Even at night, fishermen working the hours when the fish rose closer to the surface, or small vessels carrying goods between settlements under the cover of the cooler air. The river did not pause for the darkness. It simply continued, as it had always continued, wide and slow and carrying everything that depended on it gently forward. The day that had begun in the dim before sunrise, with water drawn and bread started, and animals stirring, and the first pale light finding the tops of the palm trees along the bank, had come, in its own unhurried way, to its end. Not with any ceremony, not with anything marked or noted, simply with the gradual settling of people into sleep, and the stars remaining above them, and the river remaining beside them, and the soil of the fields holding quietly in the dim everything it had been given by the flood. It was an ordinary day, and ordinary days, lived fully inside a world shaped by water and light, and the slow turning of seasons, are not small things. They are the whole of it, really, the whole of what it means to be alive somewhere, in some particular time, with particular people, under a particular sky. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.